Welcome to NightlyHaven. I'm your host, Nikki. When people think of monsters, they usually imagine things from movies. Creatures with claws, creatures with glowing eyes, something chasing people through the darkness. But what if some of the strangest monsters aren't hiding in some faraway jungle? What if they're hiding right here in the forest of Pennsylvania? Because long before smartphones, cameras, and the internet, people living on the mountains had their own stories. Stories of strange creatures seen between the trees, unexplained sounds echoing through the valleys, and things that didn't quite fit into a world they knew. Some of these legends were told by farmers, some by hunters, some by lumberjacks who spent weeks surrounded by nothing but endless forests. Now, are these creatures real? That depends on who you ask. To some, they're nothing more than campfire stories passed down through generations. To others, they're mysteries waiting to be solved. So today, we're stepping away from the haunted houses and ghost stories and heading into the wild, because sometimes the most unsettling things aren't found in abandoned buildings. Sometimes they're waiting where the trees get thick and the trails disappear.
Fear tingles down your spine and hairs stand on end. Mysteries unknown and tales in the dark. Are you ready? Hello?
Deep in the forest of Pennsylvania, during the days when lumber camps stretched across the mountains, workers shared stories about creatures unlike anything they've ever seen. A creature called the Squonk. Unlike many legendary monsters, the Squonk wasn't described as dangerous. It wasn't a predator. It didn't hunt humans. Actually, the Squonk was said to be hiding from us. According to legend, the Squonk was an unusual-looking creature with loose, wrinkled skin and features it considered embarrassing. The creature supposedly knew it was different, and because of that, it spent its life hiding deep in the forest, crying constantly. Now imagine walking through the Pennsylvania woods at night, the fire is getting low, the trees are moving in the wind, and somewhere in the darkness you hear something crying. Not a scream, not an animal call, a lonely, heartbreaking sound. Of course, humans being humans, someone eventually decided, that sounds mysterious, I should capture it. Because apparently our first instinct when we hear something crying in the woods is not always, maybe we should leave. According to the legend, a hunter followed the trail of tears and managed to catch the Squonk. He placed it in a sack and carried it home. But during the journey, the creature became silent. When the hunter opened the bag, the Squonk was gone. All that remained was a puddle of tears. A strange ending for one of Pennsylvania's strangest creatures. Now, the Squonk is considered folklore, part of tradition known as fearsome critters stories that lumberjacks shared while working in remote forests. But maybe that's why the legend survived, because the Squonk isn't really a monster, it's a reminder of something very human. The fear of being different, and the desire to disappear when the world feels too much. And honestly, in a world full of monsters, a creature whose greatest power is crying might be the most relatable one. If the Squonk in Pennsylvania's saddest creature, the Albatwitch might be its strangest. Hidden within Pennsylvania Dutch folklore is legend of a small, mysterious woodland creature called the Albatwitch. Unlike the massive creature of modern monster stories, the Albatwitch was supposedly tiny. Some stories described it as only a few feet tall, covered in hair, and living among the trees. But what makes this creature famous isn't its size, it's what it supposedly did. It stole apples. Yes, a creature from the Pennsylvania woods known mostly for stealing fruit. Not exactly the terrifying reputation of a dragon or a werewolf, but imagine being a farmer in the 1800s and you notice your apples are disappearing. You check for animals, nothing. You check for tracks, nothing. And then one day you look up and there's a tiny little hairy creature sitting in a tree enjoying your lunch. The Albatwitch became part of Pennsylvania folklore, especially around areas like Columbia County. Some stories described it as mischievous, others described it as shy and secretive. And like many old legends, the creature may have started as a way for people to explain strange things happening around them. Missing crops, sounds in the woods, movement in the trees. Before modern science gave people answers, folklore filled in the blanks. And maybe that's why these stories remain, because even today, when we walk through the woods, part of us still wonder, what is moving just beyond where we can see? Most monster stories happen in the forest, but Pennsylvania has a creature said to live somewhere much darker, beneath the surface. Raystown Lake is one of Pennsylvania's largest lakes. beautiful, peaceful, and according to legend, possibly hiding something enormous below. The creature became known as the Raised Town Ray. Reports describe a mysterious animal moving through the water. Some claim to have seen a large shape beneath the surface. Others describe unusual waves or disturbances when there appears to be no obvious cause. Of course, lakes are full of mysteries: large fish, floating debris, changes in water movement, things beneath the surface we don't immediately understand. But that hasn't stopped lake monster legends from appearing all over the world, because there is something about deep water that captures our imagination. We can explore forests, we can climb mountains, but there is still an entire world beneath the surface of our lakes and oceans that remain hidden. And maybe that's why the stories like the Raised Town Ray survive, because every time someone looks across a quiet lake, there's always a little thought: what if something's looking back? When people hear the word Bigfoot, most people picture the famous image: a massive creature covered in dark hair, walking silently through the forest. But in Pennsylvania, has its own long history of Bigfoot stories. In fact, the state's dense forest, mountain ranges, and remote wilderness have made it one of the places where sightings continue to be reported. The stories usually follow a familiar pattern. Someone is driving along a quiet mountain road, a hunter is sitting in the woods waiting for sunrise, a hiker is walking a trail when suddenly they notice something is watching them. Not a deer, not a bear, something standing upright. Something that doesn't move like any animals they recognize, and then it's gone. Now, before we start imagining a giant creature hiding behind every tree, there are many possible explanations for these encounters. The human brain is incredible, but it's also really good at filling in missing information. A shadow in the wrong light, a person wearing camouflage, a bear standing briefly on its hind legs, a strange sound traveling through the trees. The wilderness can make ordinary things feel extraordinary. But the interesting thing about the Bigfoot legends isn't just whether the creature exists, it's why people continue telling the stories. For generations, humans have created legends about what lives beyond the edge of civilization: the unknown places, the places where the road ends, the places where the forest becomes so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Because deep down, we know there's still places on Earth where we don't see everything, and sometimes that mystery is enough to keep the legend alive. Not every creature legend begins with someone seeing something. Sometimes it begins with a sound. In Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, there is a local legend known as the Susquehanna Screamer. The story centers around reports of a strange, unexplained scream heard near the Susquehanna River area. People describe it as something between an animal call and a human cry. Something loud, something unnatural, something that makes you stop and think, should I really be standing here right now? Over the years, different explanations have been suggested. Some believe it could be a large animal, some believe it could be an echo carrying sounds from farther away, and some believe there is something stranger happening in the woods. But the most unsettling part about stories like this is that sounds can be even more frightening than seeing something. When you see something strange, your brain tries to understand it, but when you hear something complete darkness, your imagination starts creating the picture for you: a branch snapping, a distant call, a scream coming from somewhere you can't see. The woods have a way of making every sound feel closer, and maybe that's why stories like the Susquehanna Screamer continue, because everyone who's ever walked through the dark forest knows the feeling, the moment when the silence becomes too quiet. Across Pennsylvania, the Appalachian Mountains, there are certain warnings that have been passed down for generations. Some people call them old wives' tales. Some call them survival advice, and some people believe they exist for a reason. One of the most common warnings: don't answer something that calls your name from the woods. Now, there are practical reasons for this. Getting lost in the wilderness is dangerous. Following a sound without knowing where it came from can lead you away from safety. But Appalachian folklore takes this idea a step further. Stories throughout the mountain talk of strange voices, sounds that imitate humans, whistles that seem to come from impossible directions, calls that sound familiar but somehow wrong. And that's where folklore becomes fascinating, because many cultures around the world have similar stories. The idea that something in the wilderness can imitate what we recognize: a voice, a cry, a familiar sound, Why? Because humans have always feared one thing above all else, something pretending to be something it's not. The forest is supposed to be quiet, natural, predictable. So when something breaks that pattern, our instincts immediately notice. And maybe that's why these stories have survived, not because everyone believes there's creatures waiting in the trees, but because every person who has ever stood alone in the woods at night has felt a tiny spark of fear, that little voice saying, maybe I shouldn't go any farther. The interesting thing about Pennsylvania creatures isn't just the monsters themselves, it's the people who created the legends. The lumberjacks who told stories around campfires, the farmers who passed down warnings to their children, the hikers who shared strange experiences with their friends. Every legend begins with someone saying, "You're not going to believe what happened," and maybe that's why these stories survive. Because they remind us that even in a world filled with technology, maps, and answers, there are still things that make us curious. The squonk reminds us of the strange beauty of being different. The Albatwitch reminds us that not every monster has to be terrifying. And the Raystown Ray reminds us that we still don't know everything hidden beneath the surface. Bigfoot reminds us that the wilderness still holds mysteries. And the Sasquatch Screamer reminds us that sometimes the most frightening things are the ones we can't see. So the next time you're driving through Pennsylvania mountains or walking beneath a canopy of trees, listen carefully, because maybe it's just a wind, maybe it's an animal, maybe it's your imagination, or maybe it's something that has been waiting there long before you arrived. Thank you for joining me today on Nightly Haven. If you enjoyed this journey into Pennsylvania's forgotten monsters, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves a good mystery. And if you have your own strange encounter, a local legend, or a story from your hometown, leave it in the comments, because sometimes the best mysteries are the ones people are brave enough to tell. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember, the world is a much stranger place than we realize. Have a good day, guys.